Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think a few people are still joining us, but we will start our proceedings. Welcome to this afternoon's Faraday Institute Research Seminar. My name is Keith Fox. I'm Director of the Faraday Institute. This afternoon's talk is given by Dr. Praveen Sethupathy. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at Cornell University. So on the East Coast of the US means that it may be midday for us, lunchtime, but it's early morning for Praveen. He's also Director of the Center for Vertebrate Genomics. He received his first degree from Cornell and his PhD in genomics from the University of Pennsylvania. He's done postdoctoral work with Francis Collins and held an assistant professorship at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. In 2017, he returned to Cornell as an associate professor, and that's where he is now. Praveen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to come and talk to the Faraday Institute today. And I think your talk is going to be on the title, Common Ground Between Science and Faith, What It Means to Be Human. And I'll hand over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Keith, for the kind introduction. And also for the invitation to participate today. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you all as part of the Faraday Institute seminar series. And I'm honored that those of you who've joined this afternoon would take your time on a Tuesday to join the event, and I hope I can make it worth your while. So as Keith mentioned, the title of my lecture this afternoon is Common Ground Between Science and Faith. What does it mean to be human? But before I dive right in, I wanted to share a little bit about me. I'm a Christian. I'm also a scientist. I have a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. So that's usually a lot to unpack, and I obviously won't get into most of it. But what is most relevant for today is that as a scientist, I'm firmly committed to the pursuit of empirical knowledge, making observations, gathering tangible data to test my hypotheses. But on the other hand, I'm also a person of deep faith in Christ and in truths that I believe science alone cannot illuminate. So sort of the Faraday sweet spot, if you will. I've committed my life to both science and faith. They don't occupy separate parts of my brain, and as far as I'm aware, they don't represent multiple personalities. They really do seem to commingle as partners for me. A shared theme between my experience as a scientist and as a person of faith is that I've never stopped learning. The entire stretch of human DNA was fully sequenced at the turn of the millennium. And when the announcement was made from the American White House, the president at the time referred to the genome as the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. And it's been more than 20 years, and some of the most basic facts about DNA still give me goosebumps. I mean, if you take DNA from just one cell in your body and you stretch it out end to end, it would take up about 6 feet, which, much to my chagrin, is taller than I am. Right? If you took DNA from all of the cells in your body and stretched it out, it would be hundreds of millions of miles. I mean, that's, from the Earth to the sun and back, many, many times over. I've thought about that a lot. Probably many of you on this webinar have heard this before, but it never ceases to surprise me because that is a lot of material, very, very tightly wound and packaged within the cells of just one body. It's really remarkable to me. I and many other geneticists, maybe even some of you, have stared at and studied for months some parts of the genome. And often just when we think we've figured out how it works, we'll get a new clue, and we'll learn that it is actually far more complicated and multifunctional than we ever originally imagined. A really kind of extraordinary and very timely example of this is the subject of the Nobel Prize Award in Chemistry this year. CRISPR-Cas9 technology has been dubbed as genetic scissors because it can be used to cut and edit DNA. This really amazing innovation from the labs of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier actually stems from work that was done back in the 1980s to study how the DNA of bacteria is arranged. Scientists found some DNA in the bacterial genome that was unexpected and unexplained. And it looked a bit like random bits and pieces, actually. But it was eventually discovered that far from being random bits, these pieces of DNA actually represented a memory of the viruses that the bacteria had seen before. And this memory could be harnessed to defeat those viruses if they ever showed up again. In just a matter of a few decades, there was a powerful transformation of our understanding of CRISPR from unexplained DNA junk to powerful antiviral defense mechanism. And this has since inspired a technology to cure devastating diseases such as sickle cell anemia. All of that, I think, is a reminder that we've only started to scratch at the surface of knowledge. And the lifeblood of vibrant science, and by the way, I think this is true of vibrant faith as well, is the willingness to wrestle with hard questions that don't have immediate or pat answers. But I have to say that this was not my experience when I was asking difficult questions at the interface of science and faith as a graduate student. I couldn't really find many partners in my journey, either at my university or at my church. And I think that we should be concerned when the academy and the church get a little too comfortable, a little too relaxed in its ways, because this holds us back from making progress in science and from drawing closer to God. It can lead to a kind of groupthink mentality or an echo chamber that can be ultimately stagnating and unproductive. So the task before me is to speak on the common ground between science and faith from my perspective as a Christian and as a scientist. I know, every generation of scientists says the same thing. So it's a bit cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's true. It's really an exciting time to do science right now, and I feel very, very lucky. It's as though we are right at the edge of a new frontier, especially in areas like genomics, but also neuroscience and astronomy. At the same time, though, we are also at a cultural crossroads, right, in terms of the role of science and scientists in shaping our worldview. This has never been more clear to some than right now as we kind of deal with mistrust that has become evident between lay public and the scientific enterprise in the midst of this pandemic. Some suggest that science is the sole arbiter of truth, that it's our only foundation of human value and purpose. Others are suspicious and wary of science because they believe there's an agenda, if you will, among scientists to marginalize faith. It's worth pointing out, and I believe the Faraday Institute has done a wonderful job of this, that if viewed through the lens of individuals throughout history, the culture war is a relatively recent one. Science and faith have actually long been productive co-laborers in the pursuit of truth. And if you want to learn more about this, I encourage you just to consider the lives of many prominent thinkers throughout history. Consider Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, or even this institute's namesake, Michael Faraday, pioneering work in electricity and magnetism. Gregor Mendel, widely viewed as the father of modern genetics, my own field. These are scholars who didn't just happen to be Christian. Their work was driven by a strong belief in a loving God of order and creativity. One very prominent individual who exemplified this is Johannes Kepler. He's a famous German thinker and scientist from the 17th century, established the laws of planetary motion, and is considered among the greatest astronomers and mathematicians. In one of his most famous scientific treatises, Kepler starts with the following words. For those of you who are scientists, imagine starting your next Nature paper the following way. I commence a sacred discourse, a most true hymn to God the Founder, and I judge it to be piety, not to sacrifice many bulls to him or to burn incense of innumerable perfumes, but first to learn myself, and afterwards to teach others too, how great he is in wisdom, how great in power, and of what sort in goodness. And then it's a whole lot of math. In another document, Kepler writes, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. Kepler didn't fall into science and then just desperately hope that science and faith could be partners in the pursuit of truth. Kepler was driven to science by an insatiable desire to learn about, celebrate with others, a creative God. The scientific lens, whatever it happened to reveal, it didn't push God out of Kepler's worldview. Instead, it gave him a window into just how amazing God is. To paraphrase the Belgic Confession of Faith that I imagine many of you are familiar with, the universe is like a beautiful book, the study of which makes us ponder the invisible things of God. Now, lest we think this is a notion solely of the Western world, a prominent example from the East is Srinivasa Ramanujan, who was born in the same city of India that my family is from. Someone who studied Ramanujan's life recently said, Ramanujan admitted mystery into his life rather than being a hardened skeptic. One thinks of mathematics as having a rigid set of steps, arriving at a very formulaic conclusion. But what's really thrilling with Ramanujan is that many of the conclusions that he came to were based on sort of a mingled set of intuition, argument, and instinct, for which sometimes he was not able to give any coherent account. He once said, an equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God. One of the key points I'm making here, of course, is that there is a much richer, though often ignored, history of partnership between science and faith that most people, especially students, appreciate today. Nonetheless, there are some commonly voiced issues that seem to prevent people from embracing the perspective that science and faith can be harmonious. In the interest of time, I just want to highlight one of these today, and that's how we think about purpose or meaning. It is apparent that randomness or stochasticity is inherent to many phenomena in biology. This can be unsettling for people because it seems to suggest that there could be no larger purpose or meaning to our lives. A world-leading neuroscientist at Stanford, Bill Newsom, who also happens to be a serious Christian, was once asked, how can a process that depends on chance be an intentional creative act of God to create human life in his or her image? And his response was winsome. Easily, he said. Scientists regularly harness random events in the service of very purposeful ends. Think genetic programming, quantum computing. If we can do it, God is certainly up to the challenge. One of the most stunning truths I've found in biology is that apparently random processes lead to ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. A really compelling example of this for me is the formation of each of our human bodies in our mother's womb. That is, the process by which each of us develops from a single cell to a whole organism. It's been said that our cells play dice en route to becoming a fully formed heart cell or lung cell or liver cell. But despite this underlying randomness, at the end of the process, a human body emerges every time. Of course, each of our human bodies is just a little bit different from one another's, but it's a human body nonetheless. How does this happen? There was an article in Nature now quite a few years ago, but it provided a poetic answer. Quote, if cells play dice, various geometric and temporal constraints on the cells can weight the dice, thus disrupting perfect randomness to convert noise into orchestrated sounds. In other words, even random processes are constrained by the parameters of the system in which they operate, and those constraints actually help shape the final outcome. Randomness does not imply lack of order or purpose, at least the way scientists usually refer to it. Instead, random processes operating under specified constraints can actually weave a beautiful tapestry. Today, I want to provide three concrete ways in which I have found through my experience that science and Christian faith harmonize with each other: curiosity, humanity, and joy. These are three shared values that I want to expound on a little bit. Curiosity. How does scientific curiosity inform or even encourage one's faith? To answer this question, I want to actually consider the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know all too well, COVID-19 is caused by a novel virus called SARS coronavirus 2. A common question over the past year and a half in the minds of many, from children to adults alike, is why would God create viruses? Embedded in this question is the assumption or the perception that viruses are bad, even evil. And it's easy to understand this assumption because as a society, we really only talk about viruses when a pandemic like this hits. And especially in the midst of tragedy, when answers are so desperately needed, it's easy to offer reflexive responses, like linking viruses to the fall of man. And they have a biblical kind of sound to them, but ultimately, I don't think they deepen our understanding of the world or of God's wisdom. But curiosity, on the other hand, is all about challenging assumptions. So, what happens when we dig deeper? What we learn actually is that human life, as you and I know it, would not even exist without viruses. We wouldn't exist. And to understand why, we have to actually first talk about bacteria. Bacteria represent the most abundant kind of microorganism in soil. In fact, if you just took a teaspoon of productive soil, you can find more than 1 billion bacteria. I mean, that's almost the population of the entire continent of Africa. Some soil and ocean bacteria, they're actually photosynthetic, meaning, of course, that they can produce and release much of the oxygen that we breathe. We're used to thinking of plants and trees this way, but many don't realize that bacteria are actually responsible for the rise in oxygen levels in Earth's atmosphere that eventually paved the way for oxygen-dependent life forms like me and you to inhabit the Earth. Even today, some estimate that 10 to 20% of the oxygen we breathe is produced by just one particular species of photosynthetic bacteria. So if you put it in another way, 1 in every 5 to 10 breaths you and I take, we owe entirely to bacteria. But there's a problem, and that is that bacteria can be very prolific multipliers. One particular strain you may know about called E. coli provides a good example. It can actually double its population every 20 minutes or so under the right conditions. So if you were to start out with just 2 E. coli, and you let them reproduce within the span of 1 day, just 1 day, there would be 10 to the 21 bacteria. So it is no exaggeration to say that if left to themselves, bacteria would take over the earth, leaving practically no room for us humans. So how do we deal with this? Well, here's where viruses come in. It turns out the main job of viruses is to keep bacteria in check. There are 10 to the 30 or more viruses in the world, and the vast majority of these don't interact with humans at all. Most of them are focused on attacking bacteria. So then bacteria develop new strategies to evade viruses. And then if viruses have to mutate and change in order to keep pace with the bacteria. And round it goes, all the time, all around us, completely undetected by our naked eye, is this never-ending germ war. And in a way, we owe our lives to this germ war, because without it, we may not even have our very breath. The one problem is that every so often, very rarely, viruses can mutate in a way that enables them to infect humans and maybe even cause a pandemic. So here's our situation. We depend on viruses. We even need them to be adaptable so that they can keep up with bacteria and the germ war. But it is exactly this adaptability that creates the possibility of a pandemic in the human population. If you put it in another way, what that's telling us is there's an inherent risk to life. But I think most will agree that it is worth it, right? Because we get to know and be known, to love and be loved. And there's a kind of unspeakable beauty and wonder in that. We started this section with the question, why would God even create viruses? But the curiosity to dig deeper, which I think is a shared value of science and faith, has led us to realize something about God. He creates beautifully balanced ecological systems where all sorts of diverse life forms can exist precisely because no one is given an ultimate upper hand over another. I like to think this is part of what maybe God meant when he looked at what he made and said, "This is good." The second shared value, humanity. What makes us human? There's been a long-standing impulse in the scientific community to answer this question with biology. That is, to identify biological features of modern humans that appear to be unique to us. One attempt has been at the cellular level. Could we define the human as a collection of human cells in which each human cell is defined by all of its contents? It seems compelling at first, but there's a problem with the approach. Many of you probably already know, one of the most remarkable discoveries in human biology is that our bodies are home to tens of trillions of microorganisms, predominantly bacteria. Tens of trillions. It's a staggering number if you stop and think about it, because that represents slightly more than half of the cells in the human body. Half of the cells in the human body are not human at all. These bacteria live alongside and communicate with our human cells in a variety of organs, including the skin and the intestine. And it turns out that it's not just that they're critical for the healthy functioning of these organs. We couldn't properly absorb nutrients or maintain energy without the bacteria that's living inside of us. So even these bacteria sort of obliterate a traditional view that a human could be defined by human cells alone. Even purely at the cellular level, we're clearly more than that. Well, what if we dig deeper, right? What if we defined a human by DNA, the genome? Believe it or not, here too we face a pretty sticky problem. Littered throughout our genome are genetic elements that originate from other species we tend to think are completely unlike us. In fact, at least 10%, this is likely an underestimate, of our human genome represents sequences from viruses that have integrated into our DNA over time. Even at the genetic level, each of us is at least 1/10 virus. And amazingly, viral DNA may have actually shaped some aspects of human biology that we take for granted today. For example, there's a growing evidence to suggest that pieces of viral DNA may contribute to the development of the human placenta. This is fascinating, right? That viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that is critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb. PBS was so taken by this that several years ago they published a Nova Next article entitled "The Viruses That Made Us Human." To me, this doesn't take away from God's authorship of our lives. Instead, it actually adds a wonderfully surprising color to the truth of Psalm 139, that God knit us together in our mother's womb. Who is to say that God cannot use viruses to accomplish this? The bottom line is that biology has brought to light a fundamental connectedness among different life forms and even links all of us intimately to the air that we breathe and the earth on which we walk. Some have argued that this points to the insignificance of humankind. It's not unlike the famous sentiment shared by Carl Sagan, one of the world's most brilliant astrophysicists and a fellow Cornellian, who said, after a lifetime of studying the universe, who are we humans? We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people. How does this view compare with what the Bible says about what it means to be human? Well, to start with, I believe we should be very careful not to read the Bible as though it were a scientific text. But that said, It is rather striking to me that humans are sometimes described in exactly the same terms as other animals. In Genesis 1, humans and animals are both created on day 6. We don't even get a separate day. In Genesis 2, humans and other creatures are both referred to as nefesh chaya, which is often translated as a living soul. So many Bible scholars have argued that even this idea of a soul is not uniquely human, perhaps. Also in Genesis 2, humans are created from the dust of the ground, which is exactly the way the formation of other animals is also described. So when it comes to the stuff we're made of, whether we're talking about Genesis or genetics, it seems we can't really escape that there's a fundamental connectedness among all animals, including humans. And the book of Ecclesiastes actually puts it rather poetically, just as the animals from the dust we came, to the dust we shall return. From a purely material standpoint, I think there's actually more agreement between science and Christian scripture than most realize. But then, according to Genesis, is there anything else that sets humans apart? Well, during the telling of how the universe came to be, the phrase image of God is used for only one species, humans. The Hebrew word that's used for image in Genesis is the same word that's used to describe royal images that a king would set up all across his kingdom when he was not physically present. Bible scholar and theologian and good friend, Dr. Richard Middleton, he defines the image of God in his book, The Liberating Image, as, quote, the royal office of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. In other words, we're called to manifest and channel the character and presence of God. Priestly service, if you will, toward the rest of creation. My reading is that the image of God is not primarily a biological feature, but rather a vocational calling that's gifted to us. In other words, according to Genesis, it seems to me it's not so much about what we're made of, but rather the priestly and creative partnership that we're called to that fundamentally sets us apart from all of the rest of biological life. So, in a way, it's worth noting that Scripture is not entirely at odds with Carl Sagan. In terms of astronomy, we are indeed very small specks in the universe. And in terms of biology and DNA, we share more with other life forms than we ever anticipated. Scripture would affirm that the significance of humanity does not arise from our own material bodies or our place in the universe, but rather in the value God Himself places on us. Why does He value us? It turns out it has very little to do with who we are and everything to do with who He is. He chooses to value us. He even chooses to partner with us as His image bearers. This is a really important theological point that may be different in emphasis from science, but I think it's still perfectly harmonious with the claims of science. This brings me now to the third way in which I think science harmonizes with Christian faith, and that is joy. I believe it is not only the calling to reflect God's character that makes us human. I think there's another piece to the puzzle, and it isn't Genesis, but actually Psalm 104 that helped reveal it to me. Most of the verses about creation in Psalm 104 seem to emphasize the purpose that the created entities serve. So, the water is to quench the thirst of the wild donkeys, the grass is food for the cattle, the trees are home for the birds, and so on. But one day, when I was reading this psalm, one verse stood out as quite different to me. It was verse 26 says that the Leviathan was created simply so it could play in the water. It reminded me that while part of God's wisdom in creation is indeed order and purpose, another part is simply for the fun and the pleasure of it. He takes delight in the Leviathan, which he formed apparently just so it could take delight in the oceans. I wondered if this should color the way that I read the entire psalm, and so I went back through it, and I saw the theme of joy suddenly woven throughout, right? The gushing forth of the springs, the singing of the birds, the wine that gladdens the human heart, oil that makes our face shine. These all make it clear that God makes things not just to satisfy needs like hunger and thirst, but also for pure enjoyment. And I think herein lies a core truth of the Christian faith, that at the heart of creation is God's joy. God has been taking immense pleasure in his creation from the very beginning, and mankind is that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in creation right alongside our Creator. We, uniquely, get to peer into and make known what Ephesians 3:10 calls the manifold wisdom of God, and thereby draw nearer to God's joy in the experience of creation. I want to dwell for just a moment on this word manifold. In English, the word is essentially just a combination of many and fold to mean an abundance of different parts or forms. But the word that Paul uses in Greek here is polupoikilos, which, to my knowledge, is not used anywhere else in the New Testament. The second half of the word poikilos means multicolored, right? Often in the context of embroidery. So, for example, of the Old Testament, the word poikilos may be used to describe Joseph's many-colored coat. This word is also used in 1 Peter and James, but here Paul puts the word or prefix polu in front of it, and that polu means multitude or many. So polu poikilos means a multitude of multicolor. Paul is clearly being extremely effusive here. The word is meant to evoke a sense of awe and wonder at how great God is, at how unsearchably vast and intricate his wisdom is, and how tremendously multifaceted and diverse his plans are. For me, at the end of the day, this is a lot of what the scientific enterprise is about. Science doesn't detract from my humanity, rather, it encourages it. It persuades me every day to open my eyes to the overabundance, I might even say prodigal amount of created things all around us. The sheer vastness of the created order and the diversity and complexity of created things is just awe-inspiring. And I think we're meant to explore, to wonder, to be in awe in a way that I believe no other animal is. As we get older, though, I think we far too easily assume an overly kind of pragmatic or utilitarian view of the world. But actually, it's all there, at least in part, simply because God enjoys it. And as humans, made in his image, I think we're called to discover it and enjoy it too. Taking deep pleasure in creation actually strongly links my experience as a scientist and as a Christian. For me, inquiry into the natural world invariably leads to awe. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made. I want to end this afternoon with two strikingly similar quotes from two very different men. The first is from Henri Poincaré, a really brilliant French mathematician and scientist of the 19th century. He happened to be an atheist, and he said, "The scientist does not study nature just because it is useful to do so. He studies it, and I might add, she studies it, because he takes pleasure in it. And he takes pleasure in it because it is beautiful." Henri was an atheist, but he couldn't escape the feeling that humans seem to have a unique privilege of experiencing wonder and delight in nature. The second quote was spoken by Jonathan Edwards, the great American theologian of the 18th century, who said, "All the beauty to be found throughout the whole creation is but the reflection of the diffused beams of that being who has an infinite fullness of brightness and glory." Thanks for having me this afternoon.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you for your talk. Very, very clear. There's a few questions come in. Please, people, do put extra questions in the Q&A box, and I will relay them one after another. I wonder, maybe I can ask a question, first of all, about what your studies in genetics and genomics have actually taught us about what it really does mean to be human. Does having human DNA, is that sufficient to make us human?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Keith. And as I briefly alluded to in the talk, I think it's really challenging to go down that route for defining humanity. In large part because what we find is that our genome is actually an interesting sort of fossil record of sequences from the genomes of other species like viruses that have actually now combined into our DNA and been co-opted for all kinds of functions that we take for granted as humans. And so it becomes really difficult to tease apart uh, what is human and what was co-opted from other non-human species, or clearly some sort of amalgam, if you will, of sequences from other species as well. So I think it becomes really challenging just to use genetics, just DNA sequence alone in defining our humanity. That being said, it doesn't mean that there aren't some really unique aspects, some stretches of our sequence that appear to be different from even our closest cousins. Of course, that is the case. But I don't know that many of us would be happy to just sort of identify one section of the genome that happens to be a little bit different from that of a chimpanzee or a monkey and say, that's what it means to be human. I think that would be too reductionist.
Right, thank you. Let me give you a few of the questions that have come in. Here's not a simple one, but a very profound one. You talked about nature being beautifully complex and balanced, but there's the other side of the coin as well. It's also cruel and contains a lot of suffering. How do you respond to that theologically and scientifically?
Yeah, it's a profoundly important question. A couple of thoughts that come to mind. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, which I believe it's been extraordinarily instructive for me, and I would heartily recommend it for those who are struggling with why there is pain and suffering in the world. It's not an extremely easy problem to think through, but I do think that C.S. Lewis offers some starting points for wrestling with that problem. So if my answer isn't satisfactory, I would recommend that someone pick up that book and go forward. The couple of points that I would say first, going back to something I alluded to in my talk, the very things that sometimes bring pain and suffering in the world are also the things that bring the greatest joy, the greatest beauty, or even the possibility of love in life. And so, to me, what I've realized is that there is a risk. There is a risk that is associated with the beauty that we get to experience, the loves that we get to have, the life that we get to breathe and live, and the risk associated with the things that we find most lovely and beautiful make us appreciate the things that are lovely and beautiful more. I say that with a great deal of humility and hesitancy. I live a relatively privileged life compared to many of my brethren across this world who are seriously struggling and in severe need. And I don't mean to make light in any way, shape, or form. Um, a lot of that is actually caused by human sin and our inability to live wonderfully with one another. But if we are talking about natural disasters and things that we believe God created that are apparently leading to pain and suffering, that's where I feel like maybe we ought to rethink what it means when something is good, right? God didn't say that it was perfect and without pain. What he said was that it was good. And that has challenged me to think about what it means for something to be good. Sometimes there may be pain involved. And in fact, most of the best things in my life have come about as a result of quite a bit of pain and long suffering. And it's, at the end of those roads that I have been able to appreciate both the journey and the destination more. So I think there's a challenge for us in really thinking about incorporating pain into the way that we think about whether something could be good.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's a question here about Darwinian evolution. Does that take things out of the hands of God, or is there a deeper purpose that we haven't yet identified in the ways in
Absolutely.
which we developed and our genomes have evolved, etc.?
Absolutely. I think this is a very natural and important question. I believe it stems, I hope I'm not out of line, Peter, in assuming this, but I believe it stems from the idea that mutations are kind of the playground of evolution, right? We need mutations to happen in order for genetic drift or natural selection to occur. And it is thought that mutations occur, quote unquote, randomly by random processes, right? And so if there are random processes that are fundamentally at play here, could God really be the author? And the answer is yes. To me, as a scientist, I actually don't find this to be problematic for the exact reason that random processes, as I mentioned in my talk, that are working under specified constraints can actually do this wonderful thing where it brings about a very purposeful, ordered outcome, but with just enough diversity so that everything doesn't look the same. Right? And so we employ these kinds of stochastic processes as scientists all the time, and we don't mean to just have things be willy-nilly. We actually allow apparently random processes to operate under specified constraints so as to bring about very similar outcomes, but slightly different each time. And I think this is a helpful way of thinking about the way that God might employ quote unquote random processes under very specified constraints. I'll also add that really famous biologist, computational biologist, recently said it's compelling for people to think about biology as random. But the space of possibilities is actually far, 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 far greater than what you actually see happening. And so what you begin to realize is that it perhaps is not as random as you might think it is, that there are actually quite a lot of the possibilities out there in space are not actually observed in nature. And it begins to make you think that even if you were to replay the tape of life, it may not actually be so different as where we find ourselves now. Simon Conway Morris has talked about this concept as well in terms of the inevitability of humans in the course of evolution. So it's not impossible at all to think about God and his sense of purpose and direction and meaning, still having sort of authorship over a process that involves the use of random processes.
Thank you. You've talked about random processes, but of course now we have the technology to direct things ourselves. Think technology like CRISPR. Do you think that could take us to a place where we're no longer human, made in the image of God, in the way in which you've described?
It's a fascinating question. I'm going to disappoint you right off the bat in saying I don't know, but I will give you some thoughts on this because I do think it is a really interesting question, one that we should be wrestling with. There's a lot of fear about leveraging new technologies like CRISPR-Cas9, and a lot of this fear is stemming from the potential unethical uses of this technology that people hear about, right? Designer babies or eugenics. And the scientific enterprise has not been immune from such immoral tendencies in the past. Pick a country, pick a scientific enterprise, we can identify ways in which science and medicine have been used to promote bias and discrimination as opposed to healing and reconciliation. So people are right to be concerned, but I think we need to take a step back and say, history sort of rhymes. There's nothing new about CRISPR-Cas9 in the sense that every time there's new technology, new medicines, new approaches, there's a new round, fresh round of worry about whether we are playing God. In fact, not so long ago in the human population, when medicines became more popular in sort of the modern sense, there was genuine concern from certain Christian groups that we were playing God, that we were delaying death, that we were cheating death, that we were somehow stepping into the role that God was intended to play. I think today most of us would look back at that and say, no, I think we were right to do that. If there's suffering, it's incumbent upon us to identify ways within our power to alleviate that suffering in as much as is possible. So I do think it's helpful to take a step back and say, rather than saying, is the technology bad? What is the purpose for which we are leveraging the technology? It's usually always why and how that gets us closer to answering some of our moral and ethical questions than the what. I can imagine even some of the hairier things that we've invented to be used in ways that are meaningful and lovely and God honoring. So I really think it's about asking ourselves, why are we doing this? How are we going about it? And are we constraining ourselves? We don't talk enough about the wisdom of setting up barriers to constrain ourselves from going off the beaten path. And I think this is something that scientists ought really to be doing over the course of the next decade as we wrestle with these tough questions. So coming back to the heart of the question, though, could we change ourselves in such a way that we affect the way that we relate to him? It's just really hard for me to imagine that because, like I said, although our biology is wrapped up in what makes us image bearers of God, I don't actually think it's rooted in that. I think that it's not so much the changing of our genomes that will alter our capacity to image God. I think it's more our attitudes. Why are we changing our genomes? And to what end are we doing these things? I think if those become so thoroughly corrupted, we will have abandoned the vocational calling to image God. I worry more about that than I do about alterations to our biology, but not to say there aren't important considerations there too.
Thank you. That leads me to ask, one of your points was on curiosity. Is there a point beyond which we can be too curious, where we're asking things that we shouldn't ask, where we're treading where we shouldn't go, and actually taking the forbidden fruit?
I very much think that is the case, Keith. Where to draw the line, I'm not so sure yet. And I think that's something we need to wrestle with together as community. And I don't think any one person has a monopoly on where we should be drawing that line. But I do think it is true. And let me give you an example of why I think this is true. When you have a child, I have 3 children, 14, 12, and 10. But not so long ago, they were really itty bitty kids, right? Who were really curious about certain things that they happened to see or hear about, right? And you make a judgment as a parent that they're simply not ready for that knowledge and that information at the age of 2. They may not be emotionally ready. It may simply just wreck them, or it may psychologically affect them in ways that are even difficult to quantify. But for whatever reason, we routinely as parents make judgment calls that they're simply not ready for those questions, that they're not ready to tackle those particular issues at the age of 2 or whatever it might be. It doesn't mean that they'll never get to it. You obviously, as a parent, one of the things you want to encourage in your child more than anything is curiosity. But there are lines where we say, okay, that we may just not be ready for that. We may not have the tools and the resources at our disposal to really process that properly. And I think it's the same way. I think that there are lines for us as humans. I believe we're going to get to explore and talk about all of those kinds of things with the Lord on the other side. But I think here we are constrained. There is a finiteness to our ability to image him. And while I believe he calls us into partnership that is creative, I do think there are lines where we ought to be extraordinarily careful, at least, to make sure that our motivations are pure and that this really does serve to honor him as opposed to just glorify ourselves. It goes back to Kepler's quote where he said, ultimately, if I veer away and this begins to be a glory of my own mind as opposed to a glory of God, I've gone off the beaten path here.
Great, thank you. Can I come back to one of your other points was one of joy, and that's something that seems to be missing at the moment, especially in the conditions of pandemic. And so much of our joy is experienced with others, others who are embodied beings. Do you have any thoughts as to, if you like, a biologist, a geneticist view on how we recover that sense of joy together?
Some of it, first of all, let me just agree that we are relational beings. And when we are living under a context that constrains our ability to be relational, it is necessarily um, uh, sort of squeezing life out of us. It absolutely is. There's no two ways about it. There are a lot of things we can try to do to alleviate that and to ameliorate that reality, but it is a reality. So, if nothing else, I think it has been revelatory, especially for those of us who have felt like, well, I don't really need as much human contact. I'm good by myself. I think that a lot of us have just taken for granted how much we do get out of being with people. Some of us seem to desire it more or need it more than others. Certainly, there's a spectrum, but I think all of us do derive life and energy and joy from just being with one another. And the inability to do so, I think, can feel very, very crippling. Now, I'm extraordinarily pleased for living in a time where we have the technology to at least be able to connect with one another via Zoom or Skype or something like that. I think as much as we complain about these technologies, we're extraordinarily privileged to live in a possibility. Um, so taking advantage of those kinds of things, I think, is wonderful, but it's not a full answer. And I think what it's allowed us to do is to think about what it means to develop our relationship with people, even without being physically near them. It's actually what we do with God all the time. God is not physically next to me, at least for me, he's never sat down next to me. And yet, I do have this calling, and I think this ability to be able to develop a relationship with him through all kinds of other means. So I think it challenges us to think about how we might maintain connections with people, maintain relationships with people without being physically there. Now, don't get me wrong, when we can finally be physically with everybody, it is going to be wonderful, and I think we should enjoy it. But this is a period of time where I think we can be challenged a little bit to think about ways in which we can connect with people spiritually, even in a remote sense.
Thank you. Let me pick up one more thing of the joy. Maybe we'll take this as a closing question, which is maybe more personal to you. What aspect of genetics gives you the most joy? What have you found the most fascinating and uplifting and awe-inspiring in all your genetic studies? And how has that helped your faith?
That's a fascinating question. Um, I have to say that I think one of the most um, truly awesome, I use the word awesome carefully there because it is not only joy giving, but also extraordinarily humbling, is that every time we feel as though we understand the function of some genetic element, the role that it is playing in some biological process, every time we feel as though we have rounded out the story and we now know what it's doing and when it's doing it, there will be a piece of data generated either by us or by someone else that will reveal, as I mentioned in my talk, oh my gosh, it's far more complicated. Not necessarily that we were wrong, but that the model that we had come up with over the course of 15 years was but an extraordinarily small, just scratching of the surface of what this genetic element might be doing. That under different conditions, in different tissues, it might actually be doing something totally different and involved in a completely different biological process. To me, this sort of multifactorial functionality of the same pieces of genetic elements never ceases to amaze me because it's like God can find so many uses for just the same thing. A parallel here is when I go to scripture and I read something that I've read for 20 years and I think I get everything about it, but because of a different context in my life or something my kids are going through or whatever it might be, suddenly that verse comes alive to me in a totally different way. It doesn't take away from all the other things I learned from that verse in the past 20 years, but there is a completely new thing I'm learning now from this verse. And so it's like God can use that same over and over again in totally different ways in different contexts of my life. Parallel when it comes to the genome. Every time I think I've understood a verse, if you will, an instruction in the DNA blueprint, I realize something else that it could possibly do. And that's been one of the things that has been just really fun and extraordinarily humbling, because I realize, gosh, for all of our wisdom and our pace of advance in science, we're just scratching at the surface.
Great, thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear a scientist talk about science being fun and the things that we discover being great and not just awesome, but fun. It's great to be involved in such an enterprise. I think we'll draw our proceedings to a close today. Thank you, Praveen, for talking so clearly, giving your personal experiences, your life as a geneticist, for telling us about curiosity and humanity. It's been a privilege to listen to you this afternoon. In person, we will give you a round of applause, as for granted for everybody that's here. So thank you again. We look forward to seeing everybody with us in 2 weeks' time, when we will have our final Faraday research seminar of this term, pick up again next term, and we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you again for Praveen, and I'll close things for today. The rolling notices will go past for a while so that you can see some of the things that the Faraday Institute is doing. Come and join in with us, and thank you everybody for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. It was a pleasure.